please welcome the Managing Director of Sustainability at Delta Airlines, Amelia DeLuca, and the Managing Director of Cowen and Company, Helane Becker, in conversation with Skift Global Tourism reporter Levitt Lily Girma. Conversation with Skift Global Tourism.
Hi, Amelia, Helane. So nice to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited for this conversation, and I'm sure our audience is as well, digging into sustainability in aviation. And we have an airline, an analyst, an investor, and a reporter to talk to our audience about this. So let's dig right in. I guess the first burning question is, why now? I mean, a couple of years ago, airlines were really pushing back on flight shaming, and they were seeing it as something that could hurt their business, and they were also pointing to other sources of emissions that were equally accountable. And so, Helane, I know that you were among the first out there to ask the question about flight shaming and how that would affect the airlines and whether they were considering it. And so, could you tell us sort of what you're seeing in terms of the why now?
Right. It's thanks for having me, Lily. It's good to talk to you. So a lot of it has to do with financing. A lot of our investors are starting to look at companies and their carbon footprint and its sustainability investing. And so it's kind of a push-pull. The investors are going down the path of wanting more sustainable investments, and then the companies are going down that same path. And I think I'm very passionate about this subject, and I know Amelia will talk about it from the airline perspective, but from our perspective, if the airline industry doesn't take the lead on this, governments are going to, and we're not, as an industry, we're not going to like the solutions. And it's really annoying that we talk about flight shaming because it's easy to do so when the reality is, do you know how much petroleum goes into the making of clothing? Do you know how much goes into server farms and other energy that's more carbon negative than aviation? And I think as an industry, we just need to be more aggressive about it. And the timing just seems right.
Great. Amelia, and you've been at Delta for years, but it's in May 2021 that you joined as Managing Director of Sustainability. So why now, from the Delta perspective, in terms of putting sustainability at the forefront?
Well, I would just echo what Helane said, and it's been great to have her voice on the forefront of this. Our investors are certainly very engaged on this topic, but I think if we go to the core of Delta, Delta is a trusted brand. It's a brand that consumers love, and so as sustainability has become more at the center of everyday life beyond just investors, whether it's our employees or our consumers, they're looking to us as a trusted brand to say, well, what are you going to do? How are you going to be part of the solution? And yes, the numbers indicate that we are a smaller part of this compared to other industries, but at the same time, we're a hard to decarbonize industry. And so what that means essentially is that while other industries find solutions, it will take us a little bit longer. And if we don't do anything, we will grow to be a big part of the problem. And so I think part of it is just making sure that the consumers know that we acknowledge where we're at in the journey and we provide solutions today. Certain things like our commitment to carbon neutrality now is saying, hey, there's activities we can do today to support the global initiative to end deforestation at 2030. That was one of the largest announcements that came out of COP26 recently. And so Delta's carbon neutral commitment is in lockstep with that. And so that's now, and then scaling of sustainable aviation fuel is the next part of that journey. And SAF is available today. It's being flown on our airplanes today, but there is not enough of it. And so the now is just because this is a journey, it's going to take us a little while, and our consumers are responding so positively, which is exactly what you would hope. And people appreciate air travel in a way I think that they never have before coming out of the pandemic.
Interesting. Okay, so let's get into that, of the how. I mean, how is this going to transform aviation, to meet the net zero by 2050 goal? So Amelia, how is Delta responding to corporate travelers who are seeking more sustainable ways to fly? What are the options right now?
Well, so I think it's important to acknowledge what tools we have available to us today. I talked about carbon offsets. That's a tool outside of our emissions, but again, an action we can take today. What's inside scope today is fleet renewals, operational efficiencies, and sustainable aviation fuel. Fleet renewals, everyone's familiar with it. We've been doing that for years to manage our costs on the fuel side. And now there's, more acceleration in that space, both with the retirement of fleet during the pandemic, as well as with next generation's fleet coming on board with efficiency gains up to 25%. So that's an incredible tool in our toolkit, something we're very familiar with. Operational efficiencies, similarly, it's just flying as smart as we can to minimize the fuel that is burned. And again, that's been an activity it's part of the DNA of an airline at this point. And so then we're left with sustainable aviation fuel. And that's where it gets interesting with corporate customers. Our corporate customers are saying, hey, my net zero target might be around 2030. Some of them are in industries where that is something that can be achieved in 2030. And they look at their portfolio and then they say, oh, and actually business travel emissions are one of my largest parts of my greenhouse gas emissions. To which we then say, cool, sustainable aviation fuel is here. Would you love to enter into a partnership with us? And we've got, I think at this point, we're getting close to about 20 deals that we have signed with corporate and agency customers, essentially sending those demand signals to those SAF producers to say, hey, there's a buyer for your product. And corporations can say, hey, I've got some tools in my toolkit to be able to achieve my goals. And then, of course, the employees at those companies also starting to feel a little bit more comfortable traveling, because not only do they have an airline like Delta that's carbon neutral, now you've got SAF part of the equation. So again, there's a lot of tools and we're seeing a lot of momentum in the corporate space.
So, but we're still a long ways off, correct? I know that Delta said that they would replace their jet fuel, 10% of their jet fuel, with SAFs by 2030. And so let's look at it from the consumer traveler side. I'm a consumer traveler. I happen to actually love Delta. And so how do consumers make better choices, and what are airlines doing to address this rising conscious travelers? Helane, do you want to tell us what you're seeing?
Yeah, well, the airlines are doing it in a lot of different ways. The first thing that they're doing is offering carbon offsets, which is something they've done for a couple of years. Another thing they're doing is removing plastics from aircraft. Delta was, I think, one of the first to do that. Alaska Air shifted to boxed water instead of plastic bottles. That's another big thing that they're doing. Amelia talked at great length about SAF. I won't add to that other than to hopefully say that we can scale it because it's such in demand and it's the quickest way to lower carbon footprint. And then the other thing that we see airlines doing, in addition to that, is working out the whole fleet renewal is obviously important, but the other thing is not so much the airlines but the government. Air traffic control can be so much more efficient than it is, and I think that's one of the things that would also improve and the whole carbon usage by making it more, I want to say more direct. There's a lot of circuitous routings, and
Right.
if we could just get it more direct and use the technology that's there, the technology is there. It's just a question of using it. So I think all those things combined over the next decade, you're going to see a lot of change. And not only do you see it in the things that we've talked about so far this morning, but you also have the whole VTOL and electric. There's a whole host of new technology aircraft that are being discussed. Electric vehicles, hybrid, hydrogen. I mean, nothing is stable yet, but that's
right. All of those
coming.
will again take time, right? And offsets. I mean, offsets are been questionable at best. I believe it's United who's very gung ho about carbon capture.
Carbon sequestration. Right, exactly. Carbon recapture and sequestration versus carbon offsets, because you can't plant enough trees to offset the carbon that you're using. There's just not enough space.
Is Delta looking into that? Yeah, thanks. Is Delta looking into that, Amelia, in terms of increasing the investment in carbon capture technology?
Certainly. I think we're looking at all tools available to us. And I think I would just comment that, on our journey to impact climate change globally, I mean, there's a reason why one of the two announcements that came out of the first 2 days of COP26 was related to deforestation. Deforestation, as well as reducing methane emissions, are two of the biggest things that we need to tackle this decade. We cannot wait, and we cannot get to net zero at 2050 without, stopping cutting down trees, essentially. And what's interesting is deforestation actually leads to 10 to 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions annually versus the 2% that we spoke about for aviation. So that's why we're super proud of the work that we are doing to, again, be in lockstep with that initiative. But then to your point, there's a future of additional solutions. Helane mentioned a few of them: electrification, Hydrogen
Right.
is both a propulsion as well as a fuel, are definitely on the cusp of what we're doing. Next generation sustainable aviation fuels are there. Direct air capture, though, I will just comment, super interesting. And actually, where I see it coming more into play is less about putting it underground, because that's just another offset, right? I mean, it's available, but you don't want to build a solution off of just pulling, carbon out of the air and putting it underground, because at some point that is also an offset. Where it comes into play, though, is creating new fuels,
Right.
which is really exciting. You take green hydrogen and you couple it with carbon through direct air capture, and you have essentially a zero emissions fuel. And so that, to me, is the future of direct air capture and where our focus has been.
Interesting. Okay, so how are the airlines going to be held accountable? Is it the markets moving forward in terms of all of these sustainability actions? Or we have a poll here, actually. And what will be the main driver of airline sustainability? And it looks like the majority are saying markets and consumers demanding it. Do you agree?
I do. And I think that's kind of where it's a beautiful thing that Helane and I are on here together, because we are both channeling the markets and consumers in terms of the urgency of this need. I mean, it's never an or solution for us, right? It's always an and. Like, it's going to be all of the solutions we've talked about. It's going to be all of the stakeholders that we've talked about. And again, if you just look at even COP26, which I had the opportunity to be on the ground there during the first week, you've got public-private sector there. You have youth activists. You have, delegations. You have Bill Gates walked by me in the hallway, right? That's how climate should be, right? Everyone should be at the table. Everyone should be demanding change. And so I think it's everything that was on that list. So again, the urgency really comes right now from our stakeholder group. And I personally love that, because it's helping us to move ahead at an accelerated pace.
Right. So speaking of change and coming up with innovative solutions, are there other ways, and we've been talking about emissions and technology, but what are some of the other ways that some of the models that the airline industry uses need to change? For instance, I know that loyalty programs were really huge for airlines during the shutdown, but this is essentially a model that encourages you to fly to reach top tiers, of those programs. And so how do you reconcile this with sustainability goals? That's got to be difficult.
For me or for Amelia?
Oh, sorry, for Amelia.
No, Helane, I will always welcome your perspective
Both
on these
of you
things.
are welcome. Yes.
I think when it comes to sustainability, to actually just take it a little bit more broadly, sustainability to me is actually about equity. It's about access and equity. And aviation is a great example of an industry that does so much to connect the world, to connect people to innovation, to opportunities. And essentially, there are communities that don't have access to air travel today. And so when I think about the sustainability journey we have in front of us, it's not only about our environmental footprint, but it's really about making sure that there's equity along the way. And so I don't think of loyalty programs in the way that you phrased it. I think about more of how do we ensure that all of our consumers have access to air travel in an equitable way as we transition, and that also have the ability to engage with it in the way that makes sense for them. Because there's no one size fits all. We talked about corporates earlier. Every corporate is tackling this differently and wants a different solution. And it's the same thing with consumers. Some consumers will continue to engage with an airline just as it's been built through those loyalty programs. But I think that next generation consumer is going to look to air travel a little bit differently, which is why sustainability is so important right now, because we want those consumers to feel confident traveling, to be able to contribute to the journey if that's what they wish to do. And so through that, I think you're going to find new ways of stakeholder engagement, including in our loyalty programs.
And could I just add one thing to that, Lily, before you go on?
Definitely.
So Amelia approached it from the consumer perspective, but the other thing that you have to think about is how important aviation is to the world's economy, and how important aviation is to a lot of things. For example, the fact that so much of the world is vaccinated has a lot to do with the fact that the world's airlines, especially with the U.S. airlines taking the lead, were able to get vaccine out to as much of the world as they did, as quickly as they did. The airline industry, through a lot of different charities, but through Airlink and others, respond to natural disasters very quickly. Boots on the ground in Haiti with doctors, for example, when there was an earthquake in Haiti, you had very rapidly, you had medical supplies, you had doctors, you had healthcare workers, you had water, clean, and that's so important. And people and governments especially have to understand that it's not about, yeah, there's a carbon issue, of course, but it's really about how important having a robust aviation industry worldwide is to responding to not only to, enabling us to do our bucket list, but also to
Right.
responding to disasters. And
No,
that's a big public service that people
I
forget
agree.
about.
I agree, and I guess I would love to. I guess what you're saying is it's not about focusing on the loyalty programs, or is that something that's just never going to change?
Well, the loyalty programs, I mean, they're important because obviously if you live in Atlanta and you're a loyalist to Delta or New York, a loyalist to Delta or whatever, yeah, I mean, it's important to keep your flying on one airline, not so much because you're loyal to the airline on a blue sky day, but on a bad weather day, at least you get a chance of getting home at a reasonable time. So I like Amelia talked about loyalty. I think of loyalty slightly differently. I keep my loyalty. I mean, obviously, as an airline analyst, I have to fly everybody, but I try to keep my loyalty to one or two airlines so that when I get stuck because it's a bad weather day, I can not if I'm going someplace,
Right.
that's a big deal. But if I'm coming home and I want to get home, it's like. But those
Yeah.
programs are really important for similar reasons to what we've been talking about.
Great. So I agree partly with that. I want to turn to a topic that comes up often on the tourism side, which is what I cover at Skift, which is visitor volume margins and over tourism. As recently as the summer, Hawaii had instances of over tourism in Maui, and the mayor made headlines because he was saying, well, I'm going to talk to the airline executives and see if they'll adjust their demand and stop bringing so many people. But we all know that's probably not happening. But I wanted to ask you, I mean, is over tourism ever considered by the airlines? And what is the responsibility of aviation in terms of the social side of sustainability and the impact on the destinations from which they benefit?
So I think this goes back to the heart of Delta's campaign as it relates to carbon neutrality, where we've really focused on saying you don't have to choose between seeing the world and saving the world. And we really believe that there are tools available now, and there will be tools available in the future as we walk towards net zero. And I think of the same thing when I think about tourism destinations that are, or ecotourism, or however you kind of frame it out. There's a lot of tools. And I think it's about holding each other accountable. I think it's about making sure that there are these very strong coalitions that are built to say, here's the problem, here's the solution. And so I don't think it's just stopping travel. I mean, clearly no one in this group thinks that. I think it's going back to the core of you should not have to choose between seeing the world and saving the world. So for Delta, that means moving into carbon neutrality now. For destinations like Hawaii, right, there will be additional solutions for them. And so that's how I think about it, is that you don't have to choose between seeing the world and saving the world. I don't know, Helane, your thoughts on that?
Well,
Yeah.
travel and tourism is a really important sector. I mean, it was pre-pandemic. It was 13% of world GDP, so you can't ignore it. And I smile because we were in Dubrovnik a couple of years ago, and they were complaining. We were there in the winter, so we were like off season, but they were complaining about over tourism. And then, of course, last year nobody went, and they were begging people to come. So you've got like both sides of it. I think the Hawaii problem will solve itself when borders, now that borders have reopened and people can travel again, with some restrictions. I mean, obviously, it's still like mask up and vaccinate or test or whatever. But I think that'll sort itself out. But I come back to, I think being able to travel kind of makes the world a smaller place, and we understand each other. And I think it promotes cultural differences. Hopefully, I've always kind of thought that. I'm not 100 after the last year. I'm not 100% certain anymore. But
I don't think any of us are certain about anything anymore. So let's dive into a quick audience question with as brief an answer as you can give us. Please dive into how to get consumers and businesses to support the higher cost of sustainable aviation fuels, because people want to go green, but they don't want to pay for it.
Well, I'm going to take the other side of that. I'll let Amelia think about it for a second. Okay. But my answer is we need to scale SAF. I mean, the technology is there, the oil companies have to respond, and they have to make it cheaper, period, end of discussion. I mean, in the short term, governments have to support it, and it has to be equal to, fossil fuel. The whole reason we use fossil fuels is because it's the cheapest form of energy, but SAF can be made cheaper. And that will happen in time, but it needs to be government incentives in order to get it there. So I'm going to take that side of the equation.
Right.
Agreed. Yeah, government goes first. And obviously the Biden administration has done some incredible work in this space. We continue to have a bill, the Blender's Tax Credit bill, which is out there, and we're hoping to get it passed into law here because that would provide some incentives. I'm incredibly optimistic with our corporate customers, again, which are very active in this space because it not only supports Delta, but it addresses their own climate goals, which again are more short-term in nature. And I think we'll see on consumers. I think the nice thing is we've got a roadmap that we've seen other industries as they've started to engage consumers. And I think not everyone will engage with SAF in the same way, but I think it's just about continuing with education awareness at this point.
Thank you. I know we probably only have a couple of minutes left in this super interesting conversation. And so I'm going to ask you, I mean, I know you mentioned earlier, I think it was both of you actually mentioning the equity, the equity that's involved in aviation. And so, how do we make sure that airlines don't just return to business as usual, given that, we have deeper inequities today than we did even before the pandemic, between the people who can fly, people who choose not to fly, and so on, or who have access to sustainable solutions. Are you seeing the collaboration, and how do airlines not just return to business as usual once numbers pick up again?
I don't think you have to look too far into the pandemic to find the proof point that we will not be going back to the way that things were. The industry came together during the pandemic, again, government, businesses, consumers, health officials, you name it, to basically say, one, how do we keep this industry alive? But more importantly, how do we make sure that it does the critical work that it needs to do? New coalitions were formed, new ways of working were formed. And that blueprint and that ability to essentially solve, again, the biggest kind of crisis this world has ever faced for an industry that was most impacted, if we just kind of copy paste that we need to work together, all these groups need to be at the table, this is a huge problem that not one part in terms of our supply chain will solve or one airline will solve, that we will all be part of this together. That to me is exactly how we need to proceed with this, is just making sure we have really tight coalitions, we have a shared understanding of the problem, and that we are all holding hands as we go.
Yeah, I think that was well put. I don't have a lot to add to that.
Perfect. Well, thank you both so much for your insights today. And I look forward to seeing what you get up to in the year ahead.
Thank you, Lily.
Thank you for
Thanks,
joining.
Lily.
Thanks, Helane and Amelia.